My name is Seth Weber. The slide's going to be way at the end. I run the valuation group at BerryDunn. BerryDunn is a regional accounting and consulting firm headquartered in Portland, Maine. Founded in 1974, so 50 years ago this year. Ironically, the same year the proposed regs came out from the DOL. So both of us turned 50 this year. What we're going to talk through today are some of the things that impact value. Because a lot of times you guys get a valuation report and you think guys like me are probably just making stuff up in the background. That's not actually true. There's a whole bunch of science and economics and math that goes on behind the scenes, and then there's also some art to make it all work out. We're going to talk a little bit about SWOT analysis, if people heard that phrase before. Okay. We'll talk about enterprise versus equity value. We'll talk a little bit about cash flows and risk. What I'm going to try to do is move through some of that quickly so we can talk a little bit about how we calculate value at a very high level, and then what can we do to drive some increased value. So this first one is, these are some of the external factors that impact value and valuation. And the reason we're talking through some of the external factors first is because these are the things that we can't really do a whole lot about day in, day out. Unless one of you has Jay Powell's actual phone number and we can call him up, there's not a whole lot we can do about interest rates. There are things we can do to prepare ourselves to be more resilient for a rising rate environment or variable rate environment. But these are the things that go on that you can't really impact. It actually changed this past year a little bit, but before this past year, what we've heard for almost a decade straight from people was hiring was the number one issue. They couldn't find enough people, right? Everybody's dealing with that. Unemployment rate, tax policy we can't do anything about. So these are the things that do impact valuation, and we've got a slide later that shows where that hits, but we can't impact. These are the things we can change. So what are some of the internal factors that impact valuation? So if we start over here on company risk profile, these are the things like customer diversification. Like if you have all of your eggs in one basket and that one client leaves, is that going to have a pretty significant downward impact on value? So if that's true, what can you guys do to start thinking about how do we get some other customers in the mix? And for some people, this is exposure to different industries. So like if you're in manufacturing and all you're doing is aero and defense, which can be very high margin, high value, should you start to bring in some other industry focus so that if aero and defense goes down, you've got something else to take on that weight? Management experience. So this is one that's interesting. Everybody here is an existing ESOP, is that right? Yeah. This is an interesting one because a lot of times we're talking to companies that are thinking about going ESOP, and we start talking about the depth of management team, and they're like, well, wait a minute, if everything's going to be driven by this multiple of earnings, and I go out and spend more money on like a heavier controller or CFO, that's going to take money away from earnings, right? Well, it is, but it's also going to lower your risk profile, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. How are you doing on succession planning? Like, what does the supplier look like? What does your geography look like? Those are all, that's kind of risk profile. On the financial performance, are you a steady and improving player, or are your earnings all over the map? Because in the valuation world, volatility, big swings up and down, translates as risk. Okay, and a higher risk, if you don't remember anything else from today, think about a big seesaw or teeter-totter. So as risk increases, we're going to push value down on the other side. If we can lower the risk profile, we're going to increase value, okay? So when we're thinking about financial performance, we're thinking about things that we can do to improve the overall risk profile of the company. I should have said yes. Perfect.
When you say financial indicators affecting your risk in the seesaw, are you talking both the bottom line as well as, say, your growth in the top line of revenues, or is it one's more effective than the other in making the seesaw?
So it's a great question. When we're looking at that, is one more effective than the other? I would say no. We're looking at the whole picture. And so one of the things that I don't have a slide of, one of the things that we track is performance against forecast. So which is great for ESOP companies, right? Because every year we go in and we sit down with the management team, and I'm sure it's their absolute favorite conversation of the year. It's not. But we talk about, well, what's the forecast? What are you expecting for top line revenue? What are you expecting margins to look like? And we kind of build all of that down through. The next year we come back and we're like, okay, here's what we saw for actual performance versus here's where you said you would be. And we actually have a couple charts where we show people that. So here's 5 years of actual performance. Here's your current forecast. And then we've got lines that show successive years forecast so they can see how they've been doing against forecast. If you're really, really good at forecasting, that's going to lower risk. But if you're having really good revenue growth, but the margin's not there, the earnings aren't there, that's still going to be risky unless there's a plan to improve that margin over time. So we're looking at a lot of different things at the same time, and that's a great question. That was the point I was about to make. If you guys have questions as we go along, either raise your hand or just shout them out, okay? One of the things we're going to show you, we are going to show you multiples in a little bit and how multiples translate to risk. A lot of times people will hear about a company and they'll hear like, oh, we're 4 to 6 times EBITDA, or we're 3 times EBITDA, or we're 7 or 8 times EBITDA. And what are some of the things that drive that? Well, a lower multiple of EBITDA typically is going to be a riskier company. And so those are going to be things like doesn't have very big barriers to entry. So those are the kind of companies where you're always worried about, hey, if so-and-so leaves and we pay out their balance like tomorrow, are they going to set up shop across the street and compete with us? If you have higher barriers to entry, or if you're in a highly regulated industry, or you have capabilities that are really difficult to replicate, like that's a great example. We have a client that moved out of one industry, offset printing, and into another industry, packaging, consumer packaging, because it was easier for people to open up a printing shop, but the amount of investment that was required to do the packaging really, really well is a gigantic moat. And so that's something that they've invested a lot of money in because it's difficult for their competitors to come and replicate that. So that drives their multiple higher. Product type. If you've got a highly differentiated product or proprietary product with high margins, that's worth a higher multiple. Management team, we always, John cleaned up the language for me, but we always talk about like one man and a shaggy dog, right? So if like one person is doing all the scheduling, all the selling, all the hiring, and that person gets hit by a bus, what happens to your operation, right? So like, do we have that? Does this kind of framework make sense? So the more you have kind of systems and processes built in, the higher margins you're going to have. And that comes in when people are like, well, okay, if this is all about trying to drive dollars to the bottom line, why are we spending money on safety? Why are we spending money on cross-training? Like, because those are the things that you can do to put systems in place to make sure that everybody's focused on being maximally productive while they're at work, right?
Two quick questions about that. So the management team, would you also say, though, that it's not
I would.
And so if the management team is like wonderful,
Yep.
but small relative to a very established workforce, is that also a strong factor?
That can be a strong factor. And the other thing is if there's that kind of impermeable barrier, right, where you've got a management team that everybody's like really good and focused and they know what they're doing, but they never kind of get that message and knowledge down to the frontline employees. So the frontline employees feel like they're working at a totally different company than the management team. That's a problem. That's going to hold progress back, right?
Second question is, how, and you'll probably get to this, but how do we communicate where in these things do you?
Hopefully we're gonna talk about that, and if we don't, let me know. But the spoiler alert is that when the New England chapter of the ESOP Association has their meetings, there's almost always a nifty 50 session, or they'll have people come in and talk about waste walks. So it's what are the little things that we can do to improve productivity or to save money, because those little things really do pile up. And so some of it is as simple as, starting a suggestion box and just seeing what suggestions that people have to make their day-to-day job easier, better, more efficient, or where's the innovation going to come from that takes that annoyance out of somebody's day, that makes it that much easier for them to get to the task at hand.
I think what I was asking was just that how if you're doing the valuation,
Yeah.
we're your client,
Yep.
and you're valuing us or our client or whomever, how do we kind of
Communicate that?
communicate to you
Yeah.
effectively enough to say, oh, hey, workforce well-trained, unique to their
Yeah.
I'm sure you use questionnaires and stuff.
We do use questionnaires, but it's the power of the site visit and going out and walking around, because and it's not just, people might say, well, that's great if it's like manufacturing or machining, but it's really any operation, because it's where's the evidence of an engaged workforce? Do people care? So my first career was as a mechanical engineer, and I'll tell you the horror story, because this is the antithesis of the engaged workforce, right? So I'm working for Cummins Engine Company, so a publicly traded company. We've got a supplier that makes the part that I'm responsible for that's headed for bankruptcy. So I've got to go out to Detroit, meet with a proposed new set of buyers, and decide whether or not we're going to keep the part there or move it someplace else. So when we pull up to the plant, which is pretty common in the Detroit area, if you have help wanted, you hang a shingle. So it says help wanted, and then you hang what specific grades you need below the help wanted sign. Their help wanted sign literally ran to the sidewalk. There was not a single thing that they didn't need help with at the plant. We walked into the lobby. The plants in the lobby were not dead, they were petrified. They had just been there and shriveled up and died on the spot, and nobody cared enough to just throw it away, right? It didn't require a new plant. It just required somebody to be like, that looks like garbage. We should get rid of that. The buyers had no idea what our part was or why it was important, but they knew we were important, because if they could secure the contract, they could get the bank loan to make the deal go through. So we left, and the guy who's in charge of our supply organization said, well, that seemed like it went really well. And I'm right out of school, and I'm like, what plant tour were you just on, right? No visual controls. Stuff was piled up everywhere. Every work site that we saw was filthy. So those are, we're looking for pride. We're looking for engagement. And that's how it comes across. And I saw some of you shaking your head. I mean, one of the things that did go away through COVID was a lot of site visits. Push your providers to come out and see. I mean, it's the same message you get for like, you know, if you go to some of these advocacy days and they're like, you know, get your elected reps out to your facilities so they can see your people and meet them. Same thing with us. Push us. SWOT analysis. You guys seen this? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And again, keep this internal, external divide in mind, because in terms of driving value, you want to have your management team and your board should really be thinking about these external, like these opportunities and threats. And it's not that frontline folks can't have ideas on that. They should. But where we want people to really focus is on those strengths and weaknesses. And so if you've identified weaknesses within your organization, what can you do in order to mitigate those weaknesses? You may not turn them into a strength, but once they've been identified, what do we do about it? And how do we make that not quite so important anymore? Do people, we talk in valuation a lot about enterprise versus equity value. And my sense is we all know what we're talking about, but the rest of the world might not. So when we're talking about enterprise value, we're really talking about the value of a whole house. So we're talking about the value of the whole business. When we talk about equity value, it's like if we translate your business into a house, like the equity value is what's left after you take care of the mortgage, okay? So if you're a new ESOP and you have a whole bunch of acquisition debt, your equity value might be quite low. Any questions on that? Man, we are gonna be, I'm not gonna promise we're gonna be out of here early because we'll get to some good stuff, but a lot of times you're gonna hear, and I've already used it once, EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. It's a proxy for cash flow. And the reason that we like this within valuation is it's, number one, we don't care whether or not you're an S Corp or a C Corp because it's pre-tax. Number two, we don't care about how much debt you have because it's pre-interest. And how many folks are 100% S Corp ESOP? Okay. So if your companies before they were 100% S Corp ESOP probably spent a lot of time worrying about taxes and trying to figure out how to maximize depreciation so that they could minimize taxable income. Once you're 100% S Corp ESOP, you don't have a current tax liability, so you don't spend a lot of time thinking about depreciation and amortization anymore. But our taxed companies do, right? And so the way that looks is these numbers are a little small. Can you guys see them in the back? But if we start, and this gets to your question, if we start with sales at the top and then we take out cost of goods, we end up with gross margin. So cost of goods should be all of our direct expenses. So what are the folks who are actually building the products or delivering the services that we're selling? What are they being paid for? So if it's manufacturing, that includes all your material cost. If it's consulting, that's your cost of delivering the contracts. If it's construction, that's all your subcontractors and your materials that are going up in there. So that gets us to gross margin. Then we take out operating expenses, which is overhead, okay? And that brings us down to operating income. We spend a lot of time looking at operating income because when we're looking at smaller companies, they're not always really rigorous about this divide between what's a direct cost and what's an indirect cost. But one way or another, that money's spent by the time we get down to operating income. So operating margin for us is a much more stable measure. And so that's one of the things that we'd look at as a driver. Like, what is that operating margin looking like? Is it increasing over time? Is it staying steady over time? Is it all over the place? And then what does that operating margin look like compared to your industry? We then add depreciation and interest expense back in. That gets us income before taxes. We take tax liability out even for 100% S Corp ESOPs. So that's, you're going to see that line, provision for income taxes. That gets you down to net income. We then add back depreciation, add back interest, add back the income taxes, and that gets you an EBITDA number. From that EBITDA number, so that's cash flow that's available. We need to invest in working capital. So as the company grows, we need to have more cash on hand in order to buy inventory or to fund accounts receivable. We need to buy new capital equipment. We need to take care of debt service, and we need to take care of our purchase obligation. So this is a great starting line, but it's not necessarily the whole story. Any questions on that? Because we're going to come back to this basic structure in a little bit.
So as part of the valuation process, would the valuation people be taking the financials kind of exactly as they are? Or would they be digging through, I'll use the example like repair and maintenance. It's, oh, hey, you bought a $30,000 new piece of such and such, flow through repair and maintenance, not depreciation. If it was in depreciation, it would be an add back.
Yep.
EBITDA would be higher and the valuation would be higher.
So
Are you digging through that, or should we need to observe that?
you all should be digging through that. We're going to look at it, but how we would see it is if suddenly repairs and maintenance spikes in a given year, then it's going to be like, hey, this was kicking along like this, and suddenly it's up here. What happened? Is that a mapping error on our side? Like, did we count something in repairs and maintenance that should have been somewhere else? Was it a mapping error on your side that it's something that, you know, you should go back and talk to your auditors or the reviewers and say, hey, accountants, shouldn't this be classified as depreciation instead? So one of the things is, even though you guys are ESOP companies, we still want to make sure that our financial statements look like what an external reviewer, bank, trustee, valuation shop would expect to see. And so even though it doesn't have a tax implication for you, we still want to make sure that stuff that should be depreciated is. Stuff that should be capitalized is, not just expense at all, right? So was that your?
Yeah, well, I'm
okay.
just saying, wouldn't with an ESOP, wouldn't there almost be a risk of the opposite?
So, well, there can be a risk that people just don't, they're like, well, it doesn't have a tax implication anymore, so it doesn't matter where it lands. And the problem is, from a valuation perspective, like, I'm still comparing you to industry, and I'm still expecting to see a certain cost structure that goes, against your company. And if your company's cost structure is out of whack compared to the industry, that can hurt you from a risk perspective, right?
Isn't that part of being an ESOP too? If you're putting money back into your employees, especially, like, Seth, high expenses go to your employees directly, so you're not necessarily getting a lot of profit because you're doing a lot of profit sharing. Like, how does that?
So that's going to be, it's a great question, but that can be a little different. So we could still get down to here, right, down to EBITDA, but then what you're going to see is, and then what's our discretionary bonus program? Or what's our discretionary profit sharing over and above what we're required to do? And that's something that, from not necessarily the focus of this session, but like, how do we do a good valuation for an ESOP company? That's an area that's always ripe for a conversation with the management team about, like, well, what is your benefit level, or what are you doing that's discretionary? Because if it really is discretionary, it probably should be added back, right?
So our the people that do our evaluation, if we have a discretionary bonus and everything else, we should be telling them that it's discretionary and they would add it back in?
They're not necessarily going to add it back in, but you should be highlighting that, right, to have that conversation. The one place that again, back to what we expect, Yeah, we have some clients, I think this is still true, that their base salaries are still pretty low and the bonus component's still pretty high. And they're like, but look, on whole, between base and bonus, you're still like at market levels. But every now and then they come back to us and are like, but our bonuses are discretionary, so we should add them all back. And it's like, no, not until your comp is at market level, right? So once you look at their market level of comp, there's not really that much left to add back. But that's a conversation that happens, yeah. The other thing would be like, in terms of adjustments, and again, different hour, different session, but like, you rebrand, or you do a new website, or you did an acquisition, and so there's one-time professional fees related to the acquisition. Those are all things that should be adjusted, because it's not going to be part of the core, ongoing, ordinary course of business. So if we boil valuation down to its kind of essential bottom line, there's really two things that we're looking at. One is, what's our benefit stream or cash flow, and what's the risk associated with that cash flow? Because if I take our cash flow and I risk adjust it, so divide by some sort of risk rate, I'm going to come up with value. So what we're trying to do is understand what's the expected cash flow of the company, and then what's the right risk to put against that. So from a communication perspective, what are the things that everybody can do to impact value? What can you do inside your company to help drive revenue, so top line revenue, to drive margin improvement, so increase earnings, and improve cash flow, right? Those are the three things. And then what can we do to reduce risk? And then what can we do to contribute to growth? So, anybody have an idea of things we can do to improve cash flow? Unfair to ask it after 3:30 on a Friday.
We actually, when I walked in, I realized that the operating account was sitting pretty flush with not a lot of interest being set against that money. And so we also had a money market, and I went back to the bank and I said, these rates are competitive to what the market was, but the company had been so kind of busy with other things that they didn't
Right.
really look at that. And so we were able to actually increase the interest we were making on the money, and we were able to sit there and let it flow between operating and the money market, and got both interest rates for both accounts.
Perfect.
Several points up.
Yep. And so better deployment of, or better treasury management, right? Like earning more money with the cash that you have on hand. The other thing that we've seen people put a lot of attention to is on their billing and collections practice, because as interest rates have gone up, lines of credit aren't as cheap as they were, right? So are we rethinking like how we're using the line? We have a number of clients that have gone back and really pushed for customer deposits, so that rather than using their line in order to front run expenses for a project, they're asking their clients to pony up the money to do that instead.
Reducing inventory, so.
Reducing inventory?
Yeah.
Yep.
Or increasing the inventory turn, so you're not sinking cash and, there's cost to it.
Perfect. What else?
Taking on more customers
More customers?
and meeting with customers, meeting their needs, asking questions.
All right. I've got another one related to that. Anybody? Anybody hit with large price increases through COVID? Anybody repriced their products and services as a result? I'm seeing people shaking yes and no. So pricing has been a big topic. The other topic around pricing has actually just been like risk management and contracts. People are starting to, if they can, they're starting to push to add purchase price variance or material variances into contracts because, when we were in this environment through COVID, pre-COVID, right, inflation was pretty low and things were pretty stable for quite a while, I'd say since probably 08, 09, right? And so a lot of people started to get pretty lazy around contracts and material price variance. COVID came along, not quite the same anymore. Utilization would be another one, but this is where if nobody's read the goal in a long time, it's good to go back and read the goal. Like, we don't want to have local optimums, we want to have global optimums, right? Instead of looking at utilization through a cell or on a machine, we actually want to look at throughput through the whole system so that we're reducing inventory, reducing WIP, and increasing, what our sales are. So these are ideas to improve EBITDA. How about, are cash flows predictable? This is another question we have. So, if you're, so I work out of our headquarters, which is in Portland, Maine. Maine's big private employer is Bath Iron Works. Bath Iron Works is great. Client base? One, United States Navy. If the U.S. Navy doesn't want destroyers, they're kind of out of luck, right? So how concentrated is your client base, right? It's also why Bath Iron Works is not actually an independent company anymore. It's part of a much larger conglomerate. Because if the Navy doesn't need a destroyer, somebody else needs tanks, and that's a different section of General Dynamics. Length of client relationships, are they contractual? We've had people who were thinking about selling their company, not necessarily to an ESOP, and all their contracts were 6-month contracts, and they would all terminate like on the 1st of January and the 1st of July. And we're like, this is not a bad plan. This is not a good plan. Like, nobody's going to want your business. Because 6 months after somebody buys it, everybody could walk away. So it's like, stretch those contracts out, make sure that they don't all terminate at the same time. What's your plan around external risk factors? This one's been easy because people had to go through this a couple of years ago with COVID, right? Like, if you've got a pandemic, how do you respond? Are you able to still work? Are you able to distance people? What does that look like? If there is a supply shock and you can't get a key component, what does that mean? Like, what are you going to be able to do? And so it's like, the more resilient your company is, so the more blows it can take and still keep moving along, the lower the risk is, right? So we want to look at that. How risky are the cash flows? So these are some things that, you'd mentioned earlier, like talking to your existing clients, right? Like, are there additional value-add products or services that you can provide, right? Expanding client relationships is a lot less risky than trying to forge into new territories with new services, right? Serving existing clients is a much easier way to go. The training of the employee base, like, are we bringing people in who are fully trained, or are we providing our own training? We've got a client that, there are a couple skilled trades that are a critical need. They started an apprentice program. Now they're creating their own. And it's been operating for a couple of years, and the beauty of that apprentice program is, with the trade that they're in, once those folks graduate from that program, they can actually sponsor a couple others. So they've got their own kind of like, they're building out their own pyramid of more skilled trades rather than relying on hiring them in from the outside. Reducing risk. These are the things that a lot of times people are focused on trying to reduce operating expenses to increase the margin. And so they're like, why do we spend money on these? But these are the things like when I worked in manufacturing, our plant went through and got QS 9000 certified. That's how long ago that was. But the beauty of the QS 9000 certification was you had all these policy manuals, right? Like if nobody showed up to work on Monday, you'd have the manual that laid out exactly how to do everything, including all the quality controls that needed to be run. And so, it's like that was a bulletproof operation. Safety is important, reducing lost time accidents, but also reducing your mod rates so that workers' comp levels are lower. Training is always huge. Cross-training so that people so you're less dependent inside your organization on any one person. And all of this really also speaks very well to ownership culture, right? These are things that, like within an ESOP, like people should be wondering, like, hey, what can I do to become more valuable? How can I help? Well, have you thought about cross-training in a couple different areas so that you can fill in when we need it? Does that track? Okay. Multiples and risk. So this comes back, not trying to make you go blind, sorry, I don't remember what slide number it was, to this guy. So slide 5, if we jump ahead. So if over here we're at 4 times EBITDA, and over here we're at 6 times EBITDA, this translates to, and you can't really see it, but this translates to different cost of equity for your company. The stuff in blue is that all that financial risk. That's those external factors that we can't do anything about. The stuff in red is company-specific risk. So if you guys have seen your valuation reports, like one section that it talks about is going to be company-specific risk. So these are the big areas that go into company-specific risk. And we'll hit on those in a second. But the thing that's interesting is, like, if you're at a 5 times EBITDA multiple, you probably have about 5% company-specific risk. This is an example. This isn't exact for anybody's company. If you have double the amount of company-specific risk, that puts you at a 4x EBITDA as opposed to 5, right? So 20%, or depending which way you're doing the math, 20 to 25% reduction in value. If you want to move from a 5 to a 6, you've got to move that company-specific risk from 5% down to 2%, right? So it's not necessarily kind of symmetric the way that goes. But what are we looking at? It's a bunch of the things that we've talked about already. How diverse is how diverse are your products? What kind of diversification you have in your supply base, or how powerful are your suppliers rather than you? What's your customer base look like? What do your competition look like? And so for those that have sat in on management interviews, some of these questions hopefully sound familiar, right? You should be getting a lot of questions about what's the competitive landscape look like? Are there new entrants? Are there people who've fallen off? What are you seeing in your customer base? Any concentration? A lot of conversations around succession for the management team. A lot of conversation around the financials. How stable are they over time? What trends are we seeing there? So what this looks like is, here's our simple formula for value. This hopefully you will not see in a valuation report. So if we take EBITDA and we multiply by some multiple, we're going to come up with enterprise value. So the value of the whole house or the whole business. So if we take a $500,000 EBITDA company and we have a 3 multiple, that's $1.5 million. So if we want to improve the value of our company, where do you think we get more bang for the buck? Should we focus on improving the 500,000 or should we focus on improving the 3? Who thinks we should improve the multiple? Show of hands. 1, 2, 2.5. Okay, about half. How many people think we should improve the cash flow? Okay, we're split about 50-50, favoring a little bit the multiple. So it turns out, if we focus on decreasing risk, so if we focus first on the multiple, almost always your underlying performance is going to improve as a byproduct. So if we think about what are the things we can do to improve risk, so what can we do to land or to serve our customers better? What can we do to push a little bit on margin, price discovery? It's not worth losing a client over. That's the worst game of chicken in the world, right? But can we get more margin? What can we do around cross-training? What can we do around, improving how we're set up internally and is it visual controls or is it having a better trained, better informed workforce on what they do day in, day out is going to drive this performance? So if we do all those things, so by the way, moving from a 3 to a 4, we go from 1.5 to 200 or to 2 million, right? We'll almost always get that improvement in cash flow. And when we get the improvement in cash flow coupled with that improvement in margin, that's 2.4, right? So a 20% increase in cash flow, a 33% improvement in multiple yields a 60% increase in value. That's huge. And if you're an early stage ESOP and the acquisition debt's being paid down, think about that as paying your mortgage down rapidly, right? So if I've got more cash flow to pay the debt off faster, I'm going to release even more value, more equity value to the plan participants. So that's a huge increase, right? So how do I get that? So this was going to be John's slide, but this is how it goes. The power of $1, right? So if I think of $1, a bunch of this is going to be my cost of goods, right? That's my cost to deliver those products or services. And then I've got my operating costs, my overhead, marketing, IT, HR, finance, right? And then for most companies, we've got these other costs around taxes. We've got interest there. We'd still have interest, but this will be interest, discretionary bonus, repurchase obligation, that type of thing. And then what's left over is this profit. So what we want to do is figure out how to increase that profit. So this is a confluence of two different ideas. We've got a client we work with. They're a very large specialty trade contractor. They do very, very well. Big projects, big margins. They brought in a consultant who looked around and he said, "You guys are doing really, really well, but I need you to suck just 1% less." So he was just looking for a 1% improvement. And then if you look in the world of people who do private equity transactions or turnarounds, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll come in and they're looking for just 1% improvements. So not very much, right? Just a little thing. Because if you start to do that math out, So if we take, this was from the beginning. Yeah, and you guys are gonna need your glasses, sorry. So if we had a $7.6 million company and we improved sales by 1%, okay? That'd be an extra $76,000 in sales. If we improve cost of goods by 1%, we have improved the gross margin from 2.7 to 2.825. So $125,000 improvement, right? If we take another 1% out of our operating expenses, so 940,000 down to 930, and we kind of follow all that math through, we get $134,000 extra dollars at the end of the year from a 1% improvement.
Unfortunately, that slide's just a little bit off.
What?
Because when you increase sales, your cost of goods increase. You have to allocate a portion of the cost of goods to the next group of sales.
But what we were saying is on that 7.6, we want to get a 1%, we want to get that 1% improvement
Yeah,
anyway.
you're going to improve 49,000. You're going to
Yep.
shave 49,000 off your first
Yep.
level, but your second column is wrong. You can't just subtract 49.
Right,
Increase, anyways, no big deal. It's just-
yeah.
Sorry.
But from a targeting perspective, we can,
Philosophy is right.
but from a targeting perspective, we can still say, even with the increased sales, we want to reduce, right? And so if we end up with an extra 134,000 at a 4 multiple, that's an extra it's over 500,000 a year in extra value. At a 6 multiple, and I'm not quite sure, my 4 o'clock Friday brain cannot wrap my head totally around this. But like at each multiple, 5 or 6, 1% improvement in sales, 1% improvement in COGS, 1% improvement in operating expenses yields a 7.6% increase in value. So in a lot of our ESOP companies, we're used to seeing like really good share price increases year over year. And there were sessions earlier today that were talking about like the diversification benefit that my experience is very few people take advantage of. One of the reasons is if you're in a well-diversified portfolio for your retirement savings plan, you're probably looking to earn somewhere between 4 and 8%. Your ESOP companies are probably returning somewhere closer to 15, would be my guess if we polled across the room, and probably higher. So a lot of people are like, well, why would I want to trade that big increase I'm getting year over year for something lower? But this is what we can do to drive that. So this is what can we do? The push is, what can you think of that impacts value on a daily basis? So how can I get that one extra job out the door? Or how can I think about getting that work done a little bit more efficiently or faster? Because those small ideas add up in big, big ways. Praxis has a whole bunch of materials on this. They help companies organize what they call waste walks. So you go through your organization, you figure out like, where do we have people who are taking information out of one system and entering it into a different system? How can we automate that? Or can we come up with a better way to move the data? Where are we stacking up materials just to restack them and move them somewhere else? Like, what are the things that we're doing in our organization that are chewing up time and resources, but aren't actually contributing to getting product out the door in a meaningful way? So if you can eliminate that, that's really powerful. Harpoon Brewery has done some of these, and I'm going to blow the exact numbers, but they were looking at maybe having to do a pretty major capital expansion because they're running out of capacity. And The problem was in the filling operation. And so the guys who worked down on the filling line came up with a different way to clean out all of the equipment between different runs. And they saved 50% of the cleaning time, which allowed them to increase throughput in the filling room by like 85%. And so rather than needing a new filling line, they just needed to like repurpose some old equipment that was sitting around anyway. Like, that's not an idea that's ever going to come out of the boardroom or come out of the executive suite, right? That's the ideas that only come from people who are doing that job each and every day. And part of the power of these ESOPs is that ownership engagement, working as an owner and thinking through like, okay, this is how I'm doing the job today. Is there a better way to do it or a more efficient way to do it? And what would that mean? And what we see is generally that's going to mean we're going to drop additional dollars to the bottom line. We're going to push share price up even faster, and we're going to contribute meaningfully to people's retirement accounts. So that's the challenge. What are the small things that we can do to eke out a little bit of margin here or there? Believe it or not, I think we've got 15 minutes left. That's me. That's John, who's not here. So once again. But do people have other questions, thoughts, ideas? If not, I'm more than happy to turn you into the closing reception, because I think after that is switchback. Yeah. Questions, comments, concerns, worries?
So you were saying your site visits impact valuation? Is that, as I walked in, I missed that part. And you recommend site visits because they impact valuation?
And because I'm a recovering engineer. Yeah. I do. I think, I don't know if site visits impact valuation, but I think it's really hard to do an accurate valuation without laying eyes on the operation.
So
Yeah,
would you-
I think I
so
get the
in your
direction.
formula where it was like the 15, 10, 5, 3%
Yeah.
piece?
So
Is it
it's,
in the red or is it in the blue? The site.
no, so site visits,
You just passed it.
sorry.
There you
Boy, it's a great question. I think it's easier to move up with a site visit so that you can prove to somebody what it is that you're doing. I think without a site visit, it's a narrative. And, we all hear a lot of narratives, but we're pretty good at like seeing whether or not that lines up with the numbers. Yeah, I mean, I wish some of my team were here to tell you. I don't know that they love site visits as much as I want them to love site visits, but that's, when you're seeing, anybody ever, so I came out of the diesel engine industry way back when, but we've got a client that does a lot of work with commercial tires. So vulcanizing rubber, vulcanizing means that you've added sulfur to the rubber, so the whole plant smells like rotten eggs. I don't mind it because I've been smelling that for a long, long time. Turns out if you have team members who are, pregnant, they really don't care for the tire factory tour. And I think that makes sense, yeah. But, part of it's just seeing the operation, seeing how it's organized and talking to distributors and seeing are they really maxed out on warehouse space, or how are they organizing their warehouse in order to eke more out of the space that they have. And sometimes, believe it or not, back to some of these small ideas, it's like, the more professionals, the more people you bring through your operations, they may have seen something, or they may see something in your operation that you don't see because you're in it every day. And so just, those little ideas can maybe spark an idea. That's what I got. So thank you guys for your time. Thank you for your patience at the beginning. And have a fantastic rest of the conference, all 10 minutes of it, and a great weekend. Thanks.